Sure. Tricia, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first. So my first experience with VR was actually in fall of 2019. I was taking Randy's like graduate course on technology and language learning, and so it wasn't like VR specific, but we had a day where we went to the VR lab and tested out some apps. And one of those was Immerse Me, if you know that one.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, pretty much from that moment, I was like, okay, I want to do research on this. I'm not sure what I want to do, but I was like, I want to do something. So then it ended up evolving, and I basically did my dissertation looking at how VR can reduce foreign language anxiety, like self-reported and physiologically speaking, and then how that in turn can improve performance in VR compared to like other learning environments. So yeah, that's how I got interested in it. And then now I've been teaching with VR, doing not random, but lots of research projects on VR. We have a lot going on. And then working for Immerse, which is obviously VR and language learning. So I'm our research manager. So yeah, that's kind of like my story in a nutshell.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and I guess my start in VR goes back to what nowadays is often referred to as low immersion virtual reality, which would be programs like, if you go way back, Active Worlds or Second Life, or for kids, Club Penguin was one that was quite available. Those are all the ones you'd interface with via a computer. And nowadays, we talk about high immersion VR, which are the headsets, right? And that's, again, where Tricia and I have been doing a lot of our work recently, as we'll talk about more going forward. So yeah, I've been working between those two. I mean, boy, it's about 20 years now.
Wow, I got a lot of experience. It's wonderful. Thank you. And you did you start with technology, or did you start with language or teaching, or what area?
So my initial teaching, I used to be a middle school teacher in Washington State in the U.S., Spokane, Washington, 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, based on my undergrad degrees, which were history and Spanish. So I taught those topics. But as often happens, I started to encounter this other field, which was teaching English as a second language. I did that because I started teaching it during the summer and realized, wow, this is where it's at. So eventually, my wife, who was also teaching in public high schools, we went back to school at the University of Arizona. I went to a program called Second Language Acquisition and Teaching, SLAT program. And that's where I kind of got my focus. And when I started here at the University of Illinois, the first semester I was here, they said, hey, is there something you might want to teach for a seminar course? I said, oh, how about something with technology and language learning? And I've been teaching it every year since.
Wow, that's great. That's cool. All right, so you started with the started with teaching in general, and then second language, and then technology. So went in that direction. Great, wonderful. Thank you.
Shall I hit VR and UAR?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I don't happen to have my headset up here, but there's one. And Tricia's got hers as well. So VR is one that many people have seen. There you go. There's a couple headsets. You're putting it on your head, so you are immersed, right, in the environment. You don't see anything else, right? Only what you're seeing through the headset. But anybody who's used VR can tell you that it is such an amazing sense of immersion that you literally can forget. I typically do VR seated, but the number of times I've bruised my knees because I'm near my desk, I forget, I turn around and smack my knee right into the side of the desk because you just absolutely forget. So that's the easiest way to think about VR. And AR, on the other hand,
AR is essentially think about like Pokemon Go or any of those things. You can hold up like your smartphone or your tablet, and you can scan something, and you'll have a little image pop up that either that has some interactivity built into it. That is AR. So it's augmented reality. So you can think about like you still have your real world, but you're bringing objects or whatever into it.
Mm.
So yeah, the most common thing that people know is like Pokemon Go. There's also something like Google Maps now that uses AR, so it's a lot less immersive, but it has its place as well, for sure.
The
Right,
AR
right.
version of Google Maps is awesome.
Really?
Mhm.
In places like Tokyo, it's integrated, where you hold up your phone and it's showing you the building through your phone, but also literally okay, go this way with arrows so that it's impossible to get lost. Well, maybe for me,
Yeah.
but most people could get lost.
That's
Then the
cool.
other one I added in was mixed reality, right? Which I don't have an example of because it's expensive.
Right,
Mixed
right.
reality. People think of the Microsoft HoloLens.
Yeah.
Or Oculus has one. The new Oculus Pro is mixed reality, where I call it the help me Obi-Wan Kenobi effect, right? Where you're wearing something, but you can see through it, but it almost makes it look like there's a hologram in front of you, whether it's a person or a skeleton or a Himeji castle, right? Appears to be in front of you in the space in a similar way to AR, but much more.
Right. Yeah, the difference is like with AR, you have to either hold up like your phone or your tablet versus like mixed reality. You still have a headset on, but it just automatically like appears in front of you.
Yeah.
So it would be kind of like you walking through a museum in the headset, and then if you see a model of the castle and it pops up within the museum, kind of thing, like you're in a room, and then is that kind of a visual?
Well, there was one called Google Glasses as well, because the idea with mixed reality going forward would be this sort of an idea where you can imagine that you're walking through a museum, for example, as you mentioned, and with these glasses on, when I look at a painting, if I have it set to that, maybe it'll pop up a little video right next to the painting on the wall to tell me about the painting, or to hear sounds, or live translation, or the text translation that you can do with Google Translate, but again, make it seamless so that it would just pop up in your vision, you know, as you go.
Wow. Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. And thanks for adding that. I appreciate that. So it sounds like that these technologies can be pretty useful for education in a variety of settings. Are they commonly used in the classroom in the US?
I will say the picture looks very different if you're talking about like university versus like K-12.
Yes.
So like in the US now, at least most universities have like at least a VR lab on campus that like you as an instructor could go and reserve a time to come with your students and do an activity. So it's becoming more and more common in the US, especially for language learning, like at the university level. I mean, there's so many people like researching it and interested in using it with their students. The problem or the difficulty with like K through 12 teachers is just getting the technology because it is still so expensive. So most like K through 12 schools do not have the funds to invest in it. So I don't think it's, I mean, I don't have the numbers, but I don't think it's as common.
Where you did see it used with K through 12, most typically would have been in the very high-tech Google Cardboard, which you're probably familiar with. But as I don't know if you two have also used Google Cardboard, but if you have, at least for me, the improvement in the technology between Google Cardboard and the Quest 2 in terms of motion sickness, because I get motion sick in real life. Quest 2 I do very well with. The Google Cardboard, which, you know, is using the cardboard headset and a phone, I could not be in there more than a minute or two before I'd start to feel really easy. I would say of the three we talked about, in terms of use, AR probably is most often because people tend to have the phone already. Then VR, but mixed reality, relatively speaking, is a lot newer and currently a lot more expensive.
Right.
Interesting though, I kind of see that maybe in the future of these technologies, if it.
But yeah, I would say there's no, I mean, I don't know of anyone who's using mixed reality in their language classroom.
No.
Yeah. But AR is becoming more common, just from your perspective. I see. Asking about what you guys are working on. What projects are you involved in together and even individually, but mainly the ones that you're involved with together?
Yeah. Do you want to talk about the first one?
Yeah. So how do I make this brief but clear? We basically first got a research grant from Meta, formerly Facebook, that involved some funding to support the research, but the main thing was 500 Oculus or Meta Quest 2 headsets. So that's a large number. We've never worked with that many before. And their goal is for us to essentially integrate them into high schools in the local community. So what we've
Ideally, underserved
high schools in the local community. So what Immerse has done is we've actually partnered with Randy and then with 2 other professors that are at the University of North Texas and the University of California, Santa Barbara. And our goal, it's going to be like a 2-year project, but ultimately our goal is to work with these teachers to figure out like, what do you need to actually use these in the classroom? What's the best way to integrate them? We're going to work alongside them to like do all the training through workshops. We're going to help them develop like lesson plans and materials they can use with their students. So the larger implementation of that is actually going to be next year, but we're going to work with a pilot school this upcoming spring and basically test everything out and, you know, like I said, figure out what do we need to do to make this work. And then we're also going to be looking at learning gains as well. So like, if we're doing all this work, does it actually lead to better language learning in the end? And we'll be using Immerse, obviously, since the grant comes through that. And I think we're going to look at Spanish language learners because that makes the most sense for now.
Where would these schools be located? Is it in the state?
Yeah, we'll have 4 in Champaign, Illinois, 4 in, I think it's Denton, Texas, like near Dallas, and 4 in California, near Santa Barbara.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
So you just got started with this. I would love to have you back after a year or so.
Yeah, we just, when did we receive the notification? It was like October, right?
Yeah. It was a very interesting process.
Yeah.
The grant process, because
back and forth.
Yeah. It's not actually what we originally applied for. Was something a bit different and a lot smaller. So when they first mentioned to Tricia this 500 number, our jaws just dropped. It's
yeah. He was like, "Are you sure you heard them correctly?" I was like, "Oh,
that's right. Are you sure?" It's
like, "Are you positive?"
Yeah.
No, but I think we found out actually end of September, but by the time everything was like processed, like we couldn't really get started till early November. So it's very, very beginning stages.
So about a week ago, Tricia and I were in the foreign languages building, which is where my office is. I got a small office space for these headsets, and we were just unpacking boxes because there's 160 of them that we've got here. And it's a little surreal, but wonderful. We already had one meeting with the high school, and they were very excited about the opportunity.
And what was that like? Like, I can imagine that just getting the technology, teachers would be a little overwhelmed and little excited, but mostly overwhelmed and uncertain how to use it. So what was that initial conversation like?
Yeah, I think,
please.
You go ahead. Oh, I was gonna say, I feel like, so the teacher we met with, you could tell she was very eager about it. So that helps. Like, you could tell she's very much like, let me figure this out. I will say her face looked a lot more calm after we told her that like, we're gonna do the training, we're gonna come in, like, especially the first few times they implement it, like we're gonna physically go, at least one of us will physically be there, just to help the teacher, and also if like, you know, tech issues come up. So I think once we told her like, we'll work with you to like lesson plan and make sure that it works for your curriculum, they were much more open to the idea.
And between us and our partner in Texas and our partner in California and some of their students and such as well, the plan is we'll be developing a website that will be pretty extensive with tutorials and apps and discussions and lesson plans. And then in summer, we want to have a big set of workshops where Tricia and I will be doing them here. And then our partner in California will be doing them, and in Texas, but synchronous, so that if I want to present, it can go to the other two locations live and vice versa, but also to let the teachers connect and to share what they're finding and their concerns and what they've been learning. And I think it'll be I'm really looking forward to those workshops. I think they'll be very exciting.
I'm sure the teachers would love that.
Those are the sorts of conversations that I think you learn so much from. So yeah, I think that's the way to go. So fingers crossed.
Yeah.
I think it'll go well.
Great. Now, what do you see though as the developers, as the trainers of the curriculum? What do you see as foresee? I guess what do you foresee as some key elements that you need to be able to cover?
Well, it's interesting for me, and this kind of connects to the question I know you're going to be asking next as well, in that we mentioned this during the meeting, that this is not, you should never, in my opinion, you should never have researchers who are going to any educational environment and saying, we have this research we want to do. Here it is. It should be about a give and take. Right? There should be a conversation with the teachers. What are you doing now? What are you missing? What do you need? Let us tell you about this technology. Here's what VR can do. Let's look at some apps together. And then based on that conversation, figuring out how it could best be implemented into their classroom, if at all. I hope it will be in this case, but you never know. And I think that's critical. Because otherwise, if it's seen as something put down from on high, they'll end up gathering dust, which would be a real tragedy. And I think in so many different fields, language and science and et cetera, there are things that virtual reality can add. Again, some of them I know we'll be talking about a bit later as well, but this is one of the nice things to me with the Immerse app. I mean, I don't work for Immerse, but I think it's a very, very, very clever VR app. The way it's scenarios and experiences, to immerse the students in a cafe or a house or a garage, so that they're seeing and using the language in context. In a way that you can't otherwise. I mean, I remember taking Spanish in high school, and we had our kind of market day where, we're scattered around the classroom trying to practice things, but yeah, you weren't in a market. You were in a grungy classroom. It just didn't feel the same.
Plastic fruit.
That's right. Un plátano, right? It just wasn't the same. That's banana. But with apps like Immerse and others, of course, but that's one thing I think they do very well, that the students can pick up these virtual objects and manipulate them and see what they are and do things with them. It's exciting. It's exciting technology to me.
Wonderful. All right. Well,
let's take a trip to Spain.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's go to Spain then. Yes, tell us about Spain. What is it? What is this?
So, I have a long-term research partner who teaches at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Melinda Dooley is her name. And the first year I started teaching here at Illinois in that technology class I mentioned, I wanted to do some things with communication technologies at a distance, because I'd read studies where people were doing chat, and then you realize in the study it's students sitting in a lab next to each other, typing to each other. And I thought, what's the point? Click, 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 click. Did you get my message? Okay.
Yeah.
There's no point. So I wanted to do something that was at a distance. So I eventually found Melinda, emailed her, and she said, that sounds really interesting. So again, for about 20 years, we've been co-teaching the same technology class every year, and her students in Spain and the students here in Illinois, including Tricia when she took the
Yeah,
class.
I did this.
They work together on projects, and they experiment with some of the technology together and do things together. So
And I'll say for them, it's really nice too, because they're all, not that it wasn't nice for us, but they're all training to be English teachers. So
Right.
all of our meetings that they're having with us, you know, they're conversing with native speakers and getting to practice English more in like a higher level.
Yeah. So Melinda and I have done over time, actually several projects, especially with low immersion VR, that where we were working with younger kids, because a number of the students who took our class together, they pretty much all are elementary school teachers, and so they're teaching, and Melinda stays in contact. So when we started thinking about doing some work in VR, she contacted one of her previous students who we've done work with before. Monica is her name, and Tricia and I were over here on the US side, and Melinda was in Monica's class, which is 6th grade students in a town just outside of Barcelona. So Tricia and I were over here. I was in a headset typically. She was on the desktop teacher interface with Immerse, and we were teaching the 6th graders over there in Barcelona, which was just, you know, wonderfully wild and crazy, but super interesting experience, because again, it gave them access to these other teachers that were an ocean away. In our case, L1 speakers of the language. I don't think that is terribly important, right? But it was exciting for them that way. They would always say, Tricia.
Yeah. Well, and they liked learning about like Illinois and where we were from too. So some cool cultural knowledge that they probably wouldn't have had otherwise.
Absolutely. So we taught a series of lessons over how many weeks, do you remember?
I think it was 10 weeks total, but like including the VR training and stuff like that.
Yeah. And of course we had to do it in small groups because only a certain number could be in Immerse at a time. Mm-hmm. So we would work with a group, but then they were doing other things in the class at the same time, the students who were not in VR. So we ended up taking them into several of the experiences in Immerse. Let's see, you probably remember them better than I do. The art gallery, the house, right? They made lots of hamburgers in the house and the kitchen.
The garage.
The garage,
yes. Activities and hobbies, and then we also did the grand hall for fun.
Oh,
for like
the dragon. Yeah, the grand hall has a dragon. They loved the dragon because if you feed the dragon, it shoots out fire. So, but again, here's where I thought it worked very well, because again, Monica was extremely gracious to allow us to be in her classroom, but we really talked with her. What sorts of things do you normally cover in your class? You know, now let's look at the experiences that they have in Immerse. Are there some of these that you think would work well for that? What sorts of vocabulary do you think you would want to have your students exposed to? And then based on that, Tricia and I took the lessons, if there were lessons already in some of these experiences of Immerse, and modified them to make sure we matched what they wanted in the classroom.
Yeah, and we even ended up like, I think it was halfway through the study, we actually shifted what we were working on because she came back and was like, they need to be practicing reading more because of some like, you know, international exam they had coming up. And so we ended up like doing a reading activity in the home scene. So it was a lot of like back and forth with the teacher to make sure that what we were doing, like she was doing comparable things in the classroom at the same time.
Yeah, wow, that's great. And it sounds like it matches what Randall, you were saying was really important, is to go back and forth, make sure you clarify what the teachers are emphasizing, what they want the children to learn, and then supplementing it through the VR. Now
teachers don't have time.
Yeah, they don't have time, right?
Time for a lesson that doesn't go along with what they're already supposed to be covering, you know.
Yeah.
So
right. Yeah, that is yeah, I understand that very, very well. Have a bunch of sixth graders from all over Japan, and they join us from their home. So we sent them a Oculus headset, or one group is with the Oculus headset, and then one group is with their computer going to be joining. So that's basically what we're trying to compare. We're trying to compare an experience just through screen versus the immersive context. And the kids loved it. They found it as if it was like, they treated it like a game. And so I'm curious, with your experience with sixth graders, what was that like? With what did you think the VR did well for sixth graders, and what do you think there were some challenges for them?
Yeah, I'll start with the challenges and then end with what it did well. So we also had issues with them focusing at times. I will say what we found, for us was actually the start was worse. As they got more and more used to kind of how the lessons worked, they did much better. But for us, what helped is we only had 6 in a time at once, and we had 2 teachers. So we could essentially break them into like little groups of 3 and then kind of like babysit them, so to speak, because there was one week where I actually had to be in there by myself, and it was almost impossible to control them because we had 2 groups. They were supposed to be doing different things at the same time, but I could only really be with one at a time, and they would just get super distracted. Obviously, I'm sure you use things like rally and focus mode. Like, we would not have been able to teach without
huge difference,
or like without being able to control their audio. One thing I feel like was really distracting, which is the struggle because Immerse wasn't made for kids, but like the alcohol in the scenes. So like our kids, like when we were in the home scene and there was the alcohol on the table, I mean, it was insane how like worked up and excited they got over that. Like you couldn't get anything done because they were just smashing bottles, and like that's the time where I
these
really
are kids in Spain where alcohol's normal for younger people. But
like if we could have turned that off and on, it would have been amazing. But I guess like in terms of what it did well, like Randy was saying, like being able to actually put them in this environment where they can pick up the apple and interact with it when we're talking about the word apple. Like we didn't measure we tried to measure their vocabulary gains, but our study design got messed up by like a strike that was going on and
strike and COVID.
Stuff. So what was I saying? But the students reported that they felt like they were learning more, like being in VR and seeing everything and interacting with us. So I do think it worked well, but in terms of like student management, it was definitely difficult. Like we had to have 2 teachers.
Right.
One thing that was interesting that we found is that when you're looking at the 2 groups in VR or in the regular classroom covering that similar topic, number one, this is not an unexpected finding, I think. Some of the kids who were very, very quiet in the regular classroom opened up in VR. But also the fact that we were looking at the language based on, you may be familiar with the Common European Frame of Reference for Languages, CEFR, which is what's used all across Europe for looking at language at different levels and what people should be able to do. The students in VR, in every case, were performing at a higher level in CEFR than they were in the classroom. And is that because everything was in context?
Right.
Maybe.
What's interesting that I'll add on to that is the groups that he's talking about. So it was the same students, but they actually performed higher in VR, even though that task happened first. So if you think about it, like they should have performed higher in the second task because they're essentially repeating kind of what they did in VR, but in the classroom. But they weren't. Actually, the first time they were using the language or doing that task, so to speak, they were performing at a higher level. So
I do think that, oh, please.
I'm just curious, how can you tell that they were performing better? Did they take a test afterwards, or was it just observation?
No, we recorded everything, right? So it was a linguistic analysis, right, of the language that they were using. Yeah, because I was usually in the headset recording. Tricia was usually on her laptop recording. Melinda was usually in the classroom where this was going on recording, and then some students were in another classroom and we were also recording over there.
Wow.
So
yeah, so we record everything they said.
Yeah.
Murky oceans of data to wade through.
Right. Wow, that's great.
It was exciting. Again, sixth graders are sixth graders. Maybe they hopefully they're a little more polite in Spain, in Japan than in some places, but the term I've used more than once, especially at the start, so kind of a bit like herding cats.
Yep.
Because it was so new for them and so exciting. But once the initial novelty factor waned, they did better. They were still sixth graders.
Yep.
But they did not lose their enthusiasm for it either, which I thought was nice.
Yeah.
So
I think it's because we're able to like switch the environment every single time,
But for kids especially, they've got to be seated, and in a classroom environment, they've got to be far enough apart so that they're not going to be swinging around and smacking each other, and that made a big difference, and it helps to keep things calmer, I think, as well. So
sure, because as you were saying, part of the class they're participating in some other activities in the same room.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but they actually had two classrooms that were being used, so they were nicely spread out. Wow.
Yeah. Anyway, well, I'd love to know. So Randall, you were saying maybe the context, having them experience the context, having that added to their learning or their output. Was there anything else that you guys, either of you, thought added to the learning?
I mean, I think also like Randy was saying, just the fact that they were more comfortable being in VR and less anxious or like stressed and less intimidated about speaking English. I definitely think like we saw with like we had a few students who the teacher said like, oh, this kid never talks in class. And in VR, like they would actually make attempts to, produce English. So I think maybe that also contributed to them like trying to say harder things than they would in the classroom where it's just so formulaic.
That's good.
I think where some of this technology is getting quite interesting and exciting to me, and I'm thinking about two apps in particular. Immerse is one of them, and Spatial is another one that I'm doing some work in too. In the time that Tricia and I were working on this study, we were always taking notes, and sometimes we would send information to the company, and next update, whoop, there were the changes, or we'd write down notes and we were going to send it to them, but then we realized the next update somebody else maybe had said something. Those changes were already made. So the technology is advancing very quickly. One of the more recent ones in Immerse, I love, what is it called? Is it scanner?
Yeah, it's like an object scanner. Yeah.
So that now, the kids can take out this scanner, and the objects in the environment, if they scan it, right, it'll have the name come up, as I'm sure you've seen, but also then save it into their own kind of vocabulary database in their own space that they can use for review later. Those sorts of changes are pedagogically really wonderful. To again have language in context like that, but also it's starting to also integrate a review system at the same time. Spatial is the other one that I was going to mention. That's another app that when it started, I mean, Tricia and I looked at it. When it started, it was really clearly aimed at businesses. There were 3, maybe 4 different spaces. This one is a conference room. This one is a board room.
This is meeting rooms that you sat in with like 10 different 3D objects. You could select like a cat and a piece of cake. It's very weird.
And I think they pretty quickly realized that business model wasn't going to make it. So they opened it up greatly so that people could bring in their own 3D models of spaces or 3D models of objects. And I started to do that. And I was taking the path going into a website called Sketchfab for 3D models, and then taking it into a 3D modeling program called Blender to make little changes. And the learning curve was a giant pain in the neck. So I finally felt like over a period of a couple months, I think I'm I'm getting this. Well, now all of a sudden, spatial Sketchfab is integrated. So you have access to over 1 million digital 3D objects for free via Sketchfab right in the spatial system. Wow. So if you have a space, you can get everything from, that Japanese stereotypes here, a samurai sword or a ramen noodle shop. They have ramen noodle shops that you can just import. Or I imported one that was a sushi bar, and it even had a conveyor belt for the sushi. Now, it's not quite as realistic as one in real life, but still the fact that sushi is going by on the conveyor belt is fascinating to me. And so I think the ability for people without having to have high technical skills to create these scenarios and locations for their students or for language exchange, which I know we'll talk about in a minute, are getting increasingly interesting, realistic, and exciting for people.
Wow. Nice. That is exciting. So what would you say? I mean, technology is good, but it is a tool. And so it can be useful for some things, but maybe not useful for other things, especially in let's focus on second language acquisition. What would you say it is specifically good for, and specifically not as good for?
Well, I'd say you definitely don't want to use it for reading and writing.
Okay.
We're talking about the 4 skills. Definitely not reading and writing. I mean, it's all about like speaking and interaction, and like Randy was saying, like telecollaborative exchanges, or just immersing students in these realistic contexts where they can either interact with objects or each other. So I feel like it's definitely, I mean, if we're thinking broadly in terms of like the 4 skills, it's definitely speaking, listening, interaction. It's not, you wouldn't want to try to use it for everything that you're teaching your students.
Right. Which I do think makes sense, because as you mentioned, VR is a technology, right? VR is not a pedagogy. And I think that's something that we always have to keep in mind, and that I always tell people, because technology is just a tool. And the example I always use, if I was in a classroom, and classrooms had these in the US anymore, I like to hold up a piece of chalk and say, this is technology. We don't think of it as technology, but it's technology. And there are ways you can use it that are good, and ways that you can use it that are bad. And I think it goes the same with everything. And I certainly agree with Tricia. It's if you're using VR, you can either use it for human to human interaction via VR, or human to computer interaction via VR. Right? So Immerse Me, one that Tricia mentioned earlier, which is a wonderful app, because it's been filmed all these different cultures. That's human to computer interaction via VR. You're seeing videos, you're seeing scenarios, questions are popping up. That's great. It has its own purpose. Immerse, on the other hand, as opposed to Immerse Me, right? Immerse is teacher to student interaction via VR. And philosophically they're quite different, but I think they both have strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, I always tell teachers, like, I think Immerse Me is great, but you wouldn't bring your students into class and put everyone in a headset and have them going through Immerse Me. You'd give them that to do at home in their nighttime when they can't interact with other speakers. It's you have to think like logically. You don't want them to all sitting there talking to a computer. But I think it's great for like self-study, like independent practice.
A great example of that would be Immerse Me has scenarios that are like a coffee place, a cafe, right, where students could be being exposed to the language, practicing the language via the computer interface. Then you could take them into something like Immerse, which also has a cafe, and there they put it into practice with other actual human beings, avatars, but they're human beings behind the avatars, to practice it, the good, the bad, and the ugly of actual communication, and the challenges that are connected to that as well.
Yeah, that's a cool combination. that sounds like it would work really well. Now, the pedagogy of course, there are different teaching styles and methods. What would you say is what are some good teaching methods that match this digital immersive environment?
Well, let me give one example, and maybe Tricia can chime in, because the example I'm thinking of is some of the stuff we did in the garage in Immerse. Right. So one thing we did in Immerse is, as you'll recall, what are the cards called in Immerse?
They're prompt cards.
Prompt cards. The prompt cards, I think of as playing cards, right? The prompt cards we put together in the garage scenario. And if you're familiar with the garage scenario, for example, there's a pegboard on the wall with some different tools on it. There's balls, there's different stuff that you'd see in a garage. And some of that was familiar to the students, but we're actually quite surprised. A lot of it was not. For example, well, I have pegboard in my garage and I have a wrench on my pegboard in my garage. None of the students, of course, knew what the heck a wrench was. It's a totally alien concept to them. So with these cards, we put a list of instructions. So somewhat task-based, somewhat almost like TPR for the students. Of bring Tricia a wrench. And take a ball and do this with the ball. And then if they successfully accomplish that for Tricia, she had the scoreboard and she would give them a point. Yeah, so that was not so much about communication, although the students did have to go to Tricia and tell her, Tricia, I'm giving you the wrench. So we were forcing them to communicate as well, but it was also about the receptive. So they saw it in writing. And I was going around helping them troubleshooting, because none of them knew wrench. So I kind of, I think there might be a wrench over that way. So they would get further cues that way. So that tended to work pretty well. And I've certainly done a lot of task-based stuff in low immersion VR too. Having them create collaborative art projects and creating instructions for other groups to recreate those projects, for example, as their task. Well, with the art one that I've done before, one reason I really like that project is what I did in that one. And now we're getting to where you'll be able to do that in these VR environments too. Have a group of students work together to construct something that's art, broadly defined.
Sure.
So I've had people create artworks ranging from their artwork was a public bathroom to somebody who created a beautiful rotating giant flower display. But if you think about the amount of language and negotiation in a group that has to take place, colors, shapes, textures, placements, so much language just to put this thing together. And then for them to have to create a set of instructions for another group to recreate it, because I have them work separately so they can't see. And then when they try to recreate it, if the instructions are good, they get pretty close. Typically, they're horrible, which meant there was a problem with the instructions and they revise. So by doing that, you've got listening and speaking and reading and writing. And VR, that the reading writing has been challenging, but I think it's advancing and advancing. So we're getting to where we can have more of that. So that's why I think task-based tends to work quite well in that respect.
Yeah, I see. Thank you.
Yeah. I'll say one thing we always made sure we were doing is that they were interacting with the environment. We never wanted them just in there and just have it be as a static placeholder that they're talking to each other with them. We always made sure whatever activity we designed was them interacting with each other, but also interacting with something that was actually in this space.
Right.
Yeah.
I think our most effective method was using the prompt cards. Because then we would tell them, hey, go pick one up, and then you have your question, or you have your whatever prompt you're supposed to follow, and then they knew that they had to go ask that question to another student, and then wait for their answer.
Ask someone how many brothers and sisters they have. Find out different pieces of information. And the thing I liked about those prompt cards too was the fact that if a kid was having problems reading the card, literally, they could show it to one of our avatars so we could see it, and they could show it to their partners. That was really cool.
That is cool. That is cool.
Another thing that got them communicating, like we did one activity where they basically had to read, we're in the home scene, and they can like arrange the different pictures on the wall. And so we had told them, like, we put up instructions that was like, hang the picture with the red umbrella on the top right or something like that. And so that I noticed them going up back and forth a lot, because, you know, they would disagree with like, oh no, that one's not supposed to go there, it's supposed to go down there. So that got them talking to each other a lot without us really having to be involved.
And maybe because they were in the class together, so they already knew each other. Maybe that helped them too.
Probably.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
I think, you know, the thing is, it's all about information gap in a case like that, you know. So if it's something where to move forward, to succeed, they have no choice. Maybe still people aren't going to talk.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's pushing them in that direction, at least. Yeah.
That's good. Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Thanks for answering my questions. That's very helpful. So, Randall, I read some of the book you edited about informal learning.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yes, I enjoyed that a lot. And I think that especially in countries like Japan, it's a monolingual country that's not English speaking. And of course, there are a lot of foreigners here, but generally, the general public do not interact with foreigners on a regular basis. And so how do they get their English exposure? Well, it's informal. It's videos, it's games, it's you know, all sorts of things like that. So I'm curious, Matt, to hear from you a little bit about this idea of informal learning and where you see it's going. How useful is it in your experience?
Right. Well, I'm getting, because Tricia and I've talked about this sort of thing a lot as well, and I'm sure she'd agree that, number one, I think the role of informal language learning that takes place outside of the classroom, and not assigned by the teacher outside of the classroom either. The role of this has increased drastically, you know, with the continuing rise of the internet and communication technologies, because people have, whether they're making use of it or not, access to native speakers of languages in ways that did not even remotely exist back when I was in high school. And in Spokane, Washington, studying Spanish, it was grim to try and find anyone to practice with. Now, if people are willing to explore, they can find speakers of almost any language in the world, right, online. So it's also one of the great under-researched areas, I think, as well. One interesting thing that's come up with some of my students this semester is one of my students was talking to me about this, and it's an idea I'd been kicking around for a while, to form, we're going to call it, I think, the International Language Chat Consortium. We'll start with some universities because we want to start more controlled. Our idea is no cost, no funding at this point either, right? But to have a consortium of university language programs, English, Japanese, Spanish, French, etc., where students from these programs would join in, and we, at this point, we're planning on using Spatial to do this. I'm developing some big spaces in Spatial, a central meeting point, and then breakout areas. Here's one for Japanese, here's one for English, here's one for French, where at designated times, anybody wanting to practice French would go to the French area, and the participants from universities in France, some of them would be there to chat with people. Informal, just informal chat. I don't care what it's about. You know, we can give some possible topics, I suppose, but just to provide a safe, easy, nice environment where they can do things and explore different areas as well. Because that is one of the challenges. Can you find, especially for kids, can you find chat partners safely?
Right, sure.
Especially for children. Now, of course, there's an increasing number also of programs out there for class-to-class connections. In Japan, that's a lot more challenging to do synchronously because of these annoying time zones that we all have to deal with. But especially for kids that age, I don't necessarily think synchronous is necessary anyway. Their language level's lower. Yeah. Asynchronous things that gives them time to compose, time to think. They can exchange videos and that sort of thing. That's not quite informal if it's still class to class. But if the communication they're doing is relatively open, it's more about the culture, right? Culture and incidental language learning in that case for the kids. But these ideas like this International Chat Consortium, again, not very long ago, that would have been all but impossible. When I started my course with Melinda in Spain, I think all we really had was Yahoo Messenger. That was it. Old school Yahoo Messenger. Now we have these tools like Immerse and Spatial, where people can join in these environments. Spatial, by the way, has some really interesting builders from Japan. You can go into Spatial, and there's recreations of a kind of city's traditional town street in Japan. There's a really cool art gallery that I stumbled across some people putting together from Japan, where they're selling digital kind of anime, custom anime art. It was really, really neat stuff. So there are really interesting things happening in this respect, and spaces where they can explore together.
That sounds interesting. And did people access Spatial through the headset, or can they also access it through the computer?
Both.
Yeah.
Both.
Yeah, headset, computer, phone,
Phone.
Anywhere in that range. Yeah.
Wow, that's very exciting. Yeah, I hope that does develop to end up being a safe place for kids, where kids can connect and things. We are doing a project with a Japanese immersion school in California.
Oh, nice. And
a English Japanese bilingual school here in Japan. So like you said, that time zone is very difficult. We're going to be doing a synchronous Zoom call next week, I think next weekend. And yeah, we on this side have to wake up at or not wake up, we have to join at 6 a.m. Yeah, so what you say, maybe the asynchronous communication in that case might be might still be this beneficial in a similar way.
Well, I mean, you can imagine in a case like that with this sort of an exchange where if the Japanese school is sending a message to the school in the US or vice versa, one advantage of doing a video response asynchronously is that then as a group, okay, what does this message mean? What are they saying to us? What do we want to say back? Sure. So it makes it kind of collaborative, but gives them time to go to that kind of I+1 level, because they've got time to think about the message and we need a word. What word would that be? And maybe introduce a new word that they'll remember because it's part of their message.
Right. That's a good point. What are some things you could share about combining VR and second language learning and motivation or anxiety or this type of thing?
Yeah, so I look specifically at anxiety. I did have participants say, like, in follow-up interviews, like they were more motivated and engaged, but I didn't like actually measure that at all. It was just kind of like qualitative feedback. But in terms of anxiety, I measured self-reported anxiety measures, heart rate, and salivary cortisol. So that's a stress hormone that is present in your spit. And basically, or your saliva, I should say, to be more formal, but it basically indicates how anxious you are or how physiologically stressed you are at the time that you collect it. So I looked at that across VR compared to a classroom, and then I ended up adding Zoom in because I was conducting this research right when like COVID hit. So it made sense. And yeah, basically what I found is that they did have lower self-report anxiety as well as the physiological data as well. Heart rate is a little tricky to measure, like if you look at the mean, because it is such a variable measurement. So I looked at it more in a qualitative sense, if that makes sense, like looking at how it evolved throughout a task in response to what was going on. But overall, we still saw a decrease in baseline for the VR environments compared to the classroom and Zoom, where there was actually an increase from their baseline throughout the task. So yeah, that was
the university students.
Yeah, university students. I don't think I could have collected physiological data on kids. That would have been getting it approved by the university was hard enough. So I think that would have been a logistical nightmare. But no, university students. And then, I did interviews and things like that too, where they talked about like they're more comfortable because it is game-like you were saying, but a lot of it is also like because they are hidden. Which was interesting because my students knew each other, so they knew who they were interacting with. It wasn't like they were anonymous, but a lot of them talked about like the degree of body language that was perceived and the fact that like in VR they didn't have to worry about what they looked like or how they were sitting or anything like that, because which is ironic too, because you do have like the embodiment, but they were using Oculus Go headsets, which does not have like the hand tracking or anything. I see. So yeah.
I'm blanking on the app you used.
I used VTime XR.
That's right, VTime.
It's like a conversation app. So it's not, honestly, I wouldn't, so bad saying I wouldn't recommend it. I was looking specifically at like speaking and interactions. And so I wanted an app. At the time when I started my research, Immerse did not exist, or like we didn't know about it. And so really when I was looking at my options, it was like, okay, I need something that's controlled. I need something that's like, they're going to really be focused on speaking. They're not going to get super distracted. And I also didn't want something that they were going to get super motion sick. So I took VTime because they're seated, because I put this in a class. And so they weren't obligated to do it, but they were kind of obligated to like do the activity.
That's still an important point though, I think, because in VTime, you're automatically seated.
Yeah.
There's no walking around. You go into a new space, you're in a chair, right? And then other people can come to join you. And if you're in a chair, and then in real life you're in a chair, motion sickness wise, you're in good shape.
I didn't have anyone getting motion sick. And I mean, then you have the problem of like, okay, but they can't really walk around and make use of the environment. So like, is it benefiting them? But again, I was looking at the anxiety side, and I did have a lot of students who said that like being in the environment impacted their conversations because it gave them ideas of things to say. We're talking about like sustainability, and they're in a garden, and so they're able to pull from things that they were seeing. So it was still beneficial in that respect.
Wow, it's great. Thanks for sharing that. And
yeah, of course,
guys, I enjoyed this conversation. I'm out of questions. No, I'm not out of questions. We finished the questions I had prepared. Is there anything that you guys are looking forward to? Anything you would like to share at the end to wrap up?
I'm really looking forward to the meta study. I think one of the not critiques, but one of the questions I've gotten a lot presenting this research is like, but VR is not accessible because it's so expensive.
Right.
So I'm really excited to be like, I think I speak for both of us. We're excited to be on a project that like the goal is to get this into classrooms and to make it more accessible for teachers. So
I'm excited, because if I think back to when Tricia and I started looking at some of these apps, 2.5 years or so ago, I guess it was. And then I think about how much already some of this technology has changed. Then I wonder in 2 or 3 more years, where are we going to be at? When I've seen the changes in Immerse and spatial and leaps forward that they've made, it's exciting. It's going to be exciting to see what happens in these areas. And, of course, with mixed reality, if that continues to develop and hopefully the price comes way down, I think that could have some mind-shattering implications for language learning and communication in general.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially places like Japan, it's really helpful to have something that can put children or people in a different location, a different space, so that they can experience the culture.
Well, thanks again for the questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paul.
Yeah, and it's the more, especially people doing work in this area, you know, these whole immersive realities. It makes so much sense for us to talk as a community and to learn from each other. So,
all right, thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Paul.
See you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.